So this is the last video about the end of the Cold War, and it deals with the decisions made by Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, who was the last leader of the Soviet Union, and how they triggered the ending of both the Cold War and actually the USSR itself. Gorbachev is a good example of the kind of debate that historians can have, and which consists in assessing if what mattered the most was the actual decisions that head of government, for example, made, or if the factors that compelled this world leader to make the decisions he made are the most important. On the one hand, you call that approach the intentionalist approach, which, yes, consists in saying that sometimes Reagan or Gorbachev or other world leaders have made decisions that have changed things a lot. And the other approach is more structuralist, which looks maybe more on the long term and the factors that explain a government's policy. I'm not saying I will put an end to this debate with this video whatsoever, but I think these two characters, Reagan and Gorbachev, are particularly good case studies of an assessment of this this discussion we can have about history. Anyway, the reasons why the USSR collapsed are pretty clear, and the historical process that led to this is rather logical with hindsight. But we must keep in mind that when it happened at the end of the 80s, it was a big surprise, because even in the USA, even in the CIA, the intelligence agency of America, most people did not expect such a quick collapse of the USSR, even though they were aware of the problems that existed in this system. And in fact, part A will examine these problems, which were not absolutely new when Mikhail Gorbachev took office in 1985. In fact, the crisis that affected the USSR was really a multiple crisis. I have entitled this part the deepening economic and social crisis, but in fact I will also deal with a couple of political issues, because the crisis was really a wide one. And as often, economy is what matters most in explaining history. And for on this respect, this graph taken from a French textbook is pretty expressive and obvious, because it shows how much the economic growth of the USSR knew a decline that started in the 60s, and that constantly confirmed itself throughout the 70s and 80s, despite or maybe also because of the decisions that were made by the Soviet government. So it's really an impressive decline, because both the GDP and the GDP per capita decreased during the period. The GDP per capita decreasing very impressively, and of course, when the average level of wealth is decreasing, an economic crisis turns into a social one, of course, and society is sick in a way. So the signs of these social and economic problems in the USSR are extremely obvious when we look at selected pictures that show how difficult was the access to goods that were in those days considered as very basic in Western countries, like meat, for example. This picture can be seen as almost a cliche of life in the Soviet Union by the 80s. It's more than, it's not really caricatural actually. I mean, testimonies really suggest that in the Soviet Union and also in many Eastern European communist countries, queuing had become a kind of national activity. There were waiting lines for more or less everything, and in particular the most essential products like meat, but also for some social benefits and things like that, to the point that a waiting line could exist for weeks or months for some services. And obviously that was one of the signs of a system that was not working well. So why was it not working well? Well, it was notably a result of the arms race, because to a certain extent the arms race had been a fuel for the USSR's economic development, and in a way the Cold War, same for the USA, was a booster for research, for innovation, and so for economic growth in the end. But by the 1970s, it had clearly become a burden in both countries, but with a much bigger impact in the Soviet Union, of course, because it's a statistic I've already presented. While it was only 6% of the US GDP that was invested in the military, which is a lot, it was almost 1/4 of the GDP of the Soviet Union. And so obviously the military spending was much too important in the economy, and that was a sign of an economy that lacked balance, that lacked diversity, and in fact that lacked productivity in the end, in particular compared to the United States of America. So a bit like the Vietnam War for the USA had led the economy to overheat, in a way the same happened with the Afghanistan war for the USSR, and problems were already much bigger. But by the 80s it was becoming very clear that the USSR could not afford the arms race anymore. People who face such widely spread poverty, and even though the Soviet societies were characterized by a certain equality and also some positive aspects such as a good education system and health system, the dissatisfaction of the people was really huge, and the political system did not permit an expression of anger. And so clearly the Soviet societies by the late 70s were marked by a general sense of despair, notably among the youth, who was rather well educated and so rather well aware that things were going wrong, and that better economic situations existed in the West. Moreover, they were also aware that a tiny elite in the Soviet society, the tiny elite at the head of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, was having better living conditions than them, even though the gap was not as wide as what it can look like in capitalist societies. Anyway, so this crisis was both economic and social. And in fact, it was also a political crisis. The Soviet model, based on the totalitarian organization of a one-party state, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union being the de facto real structure of government. And so, in fact, when we talk about the Soviet leaders, in fact, we often don't talk about the actual head of state, which was sometimes the secondary politician, but the general secretary of the Communist Party. if you had control over the party, you had control over the state. That had been the case of Stalin. That was in fact a system created by Stalin, later by Khrushchev, and from 1964 to 1982, the extremely long rule, and we could almost, we'd like to say reign in a way, of Leonid Brezhnev. Okay, so such a long time in office, of course, seen from the point of view of a liberal democracy, looks like a problem. But what was maybe even more problematic for people in Russia was the strange period that followed the presence of Brezhnev at the head of the state. Obviously, the biggest problem for them was probably the lack of liberty and the fact that even though terror was really inferior to what it had been in Stalin's days until the 50s, political oppression still existed, and so political opposition was mostly absent, at least from the public sphere. The strange thing was that once Brezhnev died, he died in office in 1982, he was replaced by another communist leader elected by the leaders of the Communist Party, what we call the Politburo, and they elected Yuri Andropov, who was as old as Brezhnev when he died, and so who was at the head of the Soviet Union from November 1982 only to February 1984, because he died very quickly. And he was replaced by another leader called Konstantin Chernenko, who ruled the Soviet Union from February 1984, but only to March 1985. And that was the moment when, even within the Politburo, it became obvious that some fresh blood was probably needed at the head of the state. And this is when a new leader for the Communist Party and the Soviet Union was appointed, and that was Gorbachev. But clearly, I think we can see just an illustration, of course, it's not a proof, but this strange period of the early 80s in the Soviet Union at the head of the state are like a symbol of a system that politically was promised to collapse. Anyway, when Mikhail Gorbachev was appointed, which means elected, but only by the elite of the Communist Party as leader of the Soviet Union, the contrast between him and his predecessors was really huge because he was young. He is the only leader of the Soviet Union who was not born when the 1917 revolution happened, which means he was also a pure product of the Soviet education and university system and political system, and he was strongly attached to his country and to the ideals of Marxism. But he also strongly believed that to save the Soviet Union, you had to change things deeply, which he did, because the reforms chosen and implemented by Gorbachev and his government were absolutely historic, because they affected his own country, but they also affected the world. And first of all, what he changed within the Soviet system, so the domestic reforms. His key idea was that the Soviet system needed more freedom, needed a certain liberalization, because the system lacked life, in fact, vitality. People were not motivated in the factories, in the economy in general. There was a lack of motivation, of sense of innovation, and even politically speaking, the the Communist Party had become a mass party, a big administrative monster, where people were not strongly motivated, or if they were motivated, they were not motivated for good reasons, actually. And in a way, we can say that Gorbachev wanted to introduce some Western principles in the Soviet system. And the names in Russian of these reforms have remained famous. Glasnost refers to the changes he made in politics. It's, I was told, a Russian word that means something like openness or transparency. And that was absolutely a remarkable change because it included lifting censorship and so permitted greater freedom of speech, which had been almost absent from Soviet life for decades. The liberation of many political prisoners from the Gulag camps and prisons. The possibility to have free elections with multiple candidates and even candidates from outside the Communist Party. So it meant the end of the one-party state. That was a real attempt of democratization. On the economic side, perestroika is the Russian word that is translated by something like restructuring, and it consisted in not a shift to capitalism that would be really excessive, but a certain liberalization of the economy, giving greater autonomy to the big companies that were still owned by the state, but that in a way were encouraged to be more innovative and to take their initiatives. And there was the recreation of a private system, of a private sector in sectors of the economy like farming or basic retailing, for example. Those were reforms that were absolutely historic within the long history of the Soviet Union. But the thing is that they had bad effects for the Soviet system in the first place. In fact, Glasnost permitted a better freedom of expression and a demand for democracy, which was good. But due to the fact that the economic situation was really poor and greatly problematic, the anger of the people was probably too big to be listened to and to be received without big political turmoil. That is what this cartoon by the very conservative British cartoonist Cummings is suggesting, that Glasnost quickly appeared as something that could be destructive for the Soviet system as it was. And in fact, the tragedy of the Gorbachev reforms is that even perestroika, so the economic reforms, had bad effects in the first place. They basically disorganized an economy that was already weak, and so immediately the first visible signs of the results of perestroika that Russian people and Soviet people in general could experience was more shortages, even worse access to basic goods. The standards of living immediately decreased faster with perestroika. And so tragically, the problems of the USSR were too big are so big that Gorbachev's attempts to solve them in fact created a very dangerous situation from a political point of view. He also made major reforms at the international level, and here his key idea was simply that for economic reforms to work, it was necessary to reduce the huge military spending of the Soviet Union if domestic reforms were to succeed. And so reducing military spending meant accepting a reduction also of the foreign influence of the USSR. Though that was a big choice. In practice, we already saw that Gorbachev signed a treaty of disarmament, partial disarmament, but symbolically very important, agreeing that the arms race was had to be stopped for the USSR. So that was the Treaty of 1987. In what we can call the Soviet Empire, which means the relations that the Soviet Union had with the countries of Eastern Europe, which did not belong to the USSR, but who lived under very tight Soviet influence, notably under the Brezhnev years, when attempts of opposition to the Soviet rule in Czechoslovakia, for example, in 1968, had been cracked down by the Soviet army, the Red Army. So this Brezhnev doctrine, which said that absolutely no autonomy would be given to Eastern European countries and that the Red Army could intervene in a situation that was seen as dangerous for the Soviet government there, this was ended. Okay, and that was extremely important. The last thing he did was to retreat from Afghanistan, accepting defeat, a bit like the USA had accepted their defeat in the Vietnam War. But going back to the Brezhnev doctrine, that was ended. That was the most important decision, obviously. At this point, with a document like this cover of Time magazine, an American magazine, extremely famous, every year they select one personality that they call Man of the Year. Thankfully, nowadays it's sometimes Woman of the Year. But in 1988, Gorbachev was chosen. And I think that's an interesting point to highlight, which is that Gorbachev's image in the Western world, USA, Western Europe, was very, very good. And still is, largely, because he's seen as a wise man, as a man that did the reforms that, morally speaking, were necessary for the Soviet Union. But seen from Russia, he is mostly seen, even nowadays, as the man who put an end to the Soviet Empire and to a form of state that used to be extremely powerful, and in particular at the international level. Okay, so his image is much different. The decisions he made triggered a chain of events that quickly led to the total collapse of the Soviet bloc, including the Soviet Union itself. So there was already some opposition, public opposition that had emerged against the Soviet rule. The country where this opposition was the most important and the most, well, and in numbers massive, was Poland, where a trade union called Solidarity had been created in the early 80s. And it was a non-communist trade union. So in fact, it was a trade union that was a bit like a political party. And in fact, the leader, Lech Walesa, would become the first president of Poland after the communist era. Why Poland? Probably, among other factors, one interesting factor that you should be aware of is that in those days, the Pope, the leader of the Catholic Church at the global scale, was originally a Polish citizen. He ruled as Pope under the name of John Paul II, and obviously, being a head of state in Vatican and the head of the Catholic Church, it gave him a certain political influence at world level, and in particular in his home country. That's maybe for that reason that it was impossible for the government to be too violent against the trade union created by Lech Walesa. And in fact, in 1988, after Gorbachev had announced that whatever would happen in Eastern European countries, the USSR would not oppose to the chain of events, massive strikes were organized, and they forced the government to organize free elections in 1989. And in fact, 1989 saw a wave of peaceful revolutions throughout Eastern Europe. In Hungary, in Bulgaria, in Czechoslovakia, and very importantly in East Germany, where the Berlin Wall was destroyed on the 9th of November, popular uprisings were met without police or military resistance, and free elections were quickly organized. The Soviet bloc was collapsing without any resistance, as something that in fact had become extremely fragile. The only country where the revolution was violent was Romania, where the dictator Ceausescu and his wife were quickly tried and executed. And in fact, this wave of independence, in a way, we can call that a nationalist wave, each nation taking its independence from the rule of the Soviet Union, reached by 1990-1991 the Soviet Union itself. Even the republics that formed the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, started to demand their independence or simply to proclaim it. Okay? I forgot to show you a picture of the reunification of Germany that happened actually 1 year later, so the date should be October the 3rd of 1990. Sorry about that. I said that even the republics of the USSR, like the Baltic states, in the West, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, and even Russia itself started to demand independence from the Soviet Union. Boris Yeltsin was the first freely elected president of Russia. By May 1990, the USSR still existed in facts and in rights, but Yeltsin had the intention of governing his country in a very autonomous way. And he was not a communist anymore. He had publicly destroyed his card that showed that he belonged to the Communist Party, and so he was in favor of a greater liberalization. And so on this map you can see that the Baltic states in blue took their independence as soon as 1989, yes. That by June Russia had proclaimed its own independence, and that the other republics forming the USSR would do the same in 1991. So the last important episode of the history of the Soviet Union took place in the summer of 1991. Gorbachev was facing growing opposition. He was really isolated because on his right, if we could say so, there were some political movements that were demanding more liberal reforms. In fact, that were demanding the end of communism. And Boris Yeltsin, the newly elected Russian president, was clearly the main figure of this political demand. And so he was challenging Gorbachev extremely deeply, even fundamentally. But at the same time, there was also some communists. So it's a bit the world upside down, you see, because we can say they were conservative communists because they were opposed to liberal reforms. But in a way, they were the left-wing opposition to Gorbachev, who believed that the machine that Gorbachev had kick-started with his reforms was an absolute tragedy, and that wanted an abolition of the reforms that had been made. And because they were facing a political dead end, obviously, in August 1991, they tried a coup d'etat. While Gorbachev was on holidays, the communist conservatives, or conservative communists, I think conservative communists is better, tried this coup d'etat in Moscow while Gorbachev was on vacation on the Black Sea coastline. It was a failure. It was a failure because the army basically did not follow the orders that the leaders of the coup were giving, and in fact they chose to be faithful to Yeltsin, the Russian president, who really exploited the situation politically, famously standing on a tank and opposing the coup d'etat, while Gorbachev was absent. So the situation was a bit complex. Communist veterans, in a way, had tried a coup d'etat against Gorbachev, but Gorbachev had been saved by Yeltsin. Okay, but in fact, after this little episode, well, little, quite big actually, Gorbachev was politically dead in the Soviet Union. His authority had completely vanished. And in fact, it immediately triggered a wave of proclamation of independence in all the remaining republics of the Soviet Union, so like Georgia, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, etc. And the very last moment of this history is so while I'm speaking, you can see that the slides actually show these states that we know nowadays that used to be parts of the Soviet Union, but which are independent states at the moment, sometimes under the threat of a Russian invasion, which is the case of Ukraine at the moment in 2021. But anyway, the USSR was dead, and it was replaced by a union, only symbolic union, called the Commonwealth of Independent States, which still exists today, but which is not a sovereign state like the USSR was. The seat of the USSR at the Security Council of the UN was given to Russia. It was widely accepted by the rest of the international community, and the nuclear weapons that used to belong to the USSR were also transmitted to Russia. And so, as I announced, the very last episode of this story is that on Christmas Day 1991, Gorbachev pronounced a long speech on TV where he summed up most of the steps that had led to the present situation and admitted with a certain honesty and courage, that he was now at the head of a state that was totally empty. There was something called the USSR, but all the components of the USSR had taken their independence, and so he resigned and shut the lights down. And as a conclusion, that's the end of the Soviet Union, of course, meant the end of the Cold War. It was probably already ended since, that depends on the way you see it, since 1987 with the treaty that put an end to the arms race, since 1989 when the Eastern European countries left the Soviet bloc, and so there was no Soviet bloc anymore, or in 1991 when the Soviet Union itself was dismantled. And so the end of the Cold War is a combination of factors which were both external to the USSR, the Reagan policy, the arms race he imposed, and even older events like the Sino-Soviet split and the rapprochement between China and the USA. All these factors have participated in leading to the collapse of the Soviet Union. But we have seen that in this video and in part 3, there were also internal problems within the bloc, with the existence of some oppositions to the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe, and also internal problems within the USSR at the economic, social level. So Gorbachev made decisions, probably some other Soviet leaders would not have taken the same decision, so he was very instrumental, and in my opinion he was a bit more instrumental than Reagan in putting an end to the Cold War, but of course this is something that is debatable. But from a general point of view, it is very difficult to see with hindsight how the Soviet Union could have survived to the big problems that affected its existence in the 1980s.